The galaxy was vast, stretching beyond what the most advanced ships could chart, filled with hundreds of planets and thousands of different species. Some were peaceful, some were fierce, and many were just trying to survive in the cold void of space. Among all these beings, there was one race that had long been forgotten, considered nothing more than a myth by most. The Slor were an ancient species, known for their wisdom and their ability to predict the future with uncanny precision. They lived on the edge of the galaxy, far from the bustle of the great empires and the heart of galactic politics. Their technology was far more advanced than anything the galaxy had ever seen. And yet they kept to themselves, watching, waiting, and occasionally offering advice to those who would listen. The Slor were a race unlike any other. Their skin shimmered like stardust, and their eyes glowed with a soft light, revealing a deep knowledge of the universe. They had lived through countless ages and witnessed the rise and fall of empires. They had seen civilizations destroy themselves in the pursuit of power, and they had seen others grow wise and peaceful, finding harmony with the stars. But there was one warning they had carried for centuries, one that they shared with anyone willing to listen. They had seen the rise of humanity, a young species that had begun to reach for the stars, and they knew that humanity's ambition, though noble in some ways, was also dangerous. It was a fire that could consume everything in its path. The Slor had sent out their warning to the galaxy time and time again, through channels both official and secret. They were not the only ones who noticed humanity's rise, but their warnings were different. Where others saw a species that could one day be a powerful ally, the Slor saw a threat. They warned the galactic leaders of the growing human presence in the stars and the destructive nature of their expansion. The message was clear. The humans are coming, and they will not be content until they have conquered everything in their path. However, the message fell on deaf ears. Most of the galactic leaders and the ruling bodies of the great empires dismissed the Slor's warnings as paranoia. To them, the Slor were an old race, their views shaped by centuries of solitude and isolation. How could they possibly understand the realities of the modern galaxy? Humanity was still new to the stars, still just a fledgling species. Sure, they were ambitious, but wasn't that to be expected from any species that began to spread across the stars? The warning was seen as an overreaction, a relic of a time when the galaxy was a much more dangerous place. The Galactic Council, the largest governing body in the galaxy, consisted of representatives from hundreds of different species. Some were powerful, with fleets that could destroy entire worlds, while others were small and struggling just to survive. The Council's main goal was to maintain peace, to prevent war, and to keep the galaxy from descending into chaos. Yet, the members of the Council were divided on the issue of humanity. Some saw potential in the humans, believing they could be an asset to the galaxy, while others feared what they might become. However, most were more concerned with their own interests, and the idea that humanity could pose a threat seemed too far-fetched to take seriously. At the heart of this debate was a powerful empire, one that ruled over vast stretches of the galaxy. This empire, known for its military strength and political influence, had long been a dominant force. Their leaders were wise and experienced, and they had faced countless challenges over the years. Yet even they had failed to fully grasp the danger that humanity represented. The diplomats from the empire met with human representatives, and while there was some suspicion about their growing influence, they ultimately chose diplomacy over confrontation. After all, the humans were still in their early stages of exploration, and their technology, though impressive, was nowhere near the level of the established powers of the galaxy. The humans were eager to prove themselves, to show that they belonged in the grand arena of galactic politics. They sent out fleets of ships, they established colonies on distant planets, and they began to trade with other species. For a time, things seemed peaceful. The humans made allies, and many of the galaxy's leaders saw them as a potential new member of the galactic family. They had a hunger for knowledge, a drive to explore, and an unyielding desire to improve. Yet beneath this facade of diplomacy and cooperation, there was an underlying truth that few dared to acknowledge. Humanity was not content with just existing among the stars. They wanted more. While the Slore saw humanity's ambition as a sign of impending destruction, the rest of the galaxy saw it as a sign of promise. They didn't understand that the very thing that made humanity special, their relentless drive, was also what made them dangerous. The Slore had lived through countless cycles of empires rising and falling, and they recognized the pattern. They had seen it before. The humans' rapid expansion into space mirrored the histories of other civilizations that had risen too quickly, consumed by their own hunger for power and resources. But the warnings from the Slore were ignored, and as time passed, humanity's presence continued to grow. They built more ships, created more weapons, and established more colonies. The galaxy watched, some with excitement, others with fear, as humanity took its first steps into the wider universe. The diplomats continued their work, but they were only a small part of the larger picture. Behind the scenes, humanity's military leaders began to see the galaxy not as a place of peaceful coexistence, but as a vast playground full of opportunities to conquer at the same time. The Slore watched from the shadows, their warnings becoming more and more urgent. They sent messages through secret channels, trying to reach the leaders of the great empires, trying to make them understand the truth. But their words fell on deaf ears. The council members were too busy with their own agendas, too caught up in the politics of the galaxy to see what was coming. They believed the humans were just another young species trying to find their place, nothing more. And so, humanity continued its journey, unaware of the dangers they were walking toward. The galaxy was changing, and soon it would be too late to turn back. The Slore knew this, and yet there was nothing they could do. They had warned the galaxy, but no one had listened. All they could do now was watch and wait, hoping that the galaxy would eventually understand the truth, that humanity was a force that would change the galaxy forever, and not necessarily for the better. The first contact between humans and the Galactic Empire was a momentous occasion, one that the galaxy would remember for centuries. The humans, who had spent decades reaching out to the stars, had finally encountered one of the most powerful and influential empires in the galaxy. It was a chance for them to prove themselves, to show that they were more than just a fledgling species. Their representatives, young but ambitious, were eager to establish diplomatic ties with the Empire, eager to be accepted as part of the larger galactic community. At first, the Empire's response was cautious but polite. They had seen many species come and go over the centuries, and they knew that not all who sought entry into the galactic fold were destined for success. Still, the humans had made a name for themselves with their impressive technological advancements and rapid growth. Their fleet of ships, though still small by galactic standards, had an air of purpose and determination. The humans were a curious species, one that had proven their resilience on their home planet, Earth. And now they sought to expand that resilience across the stars. The Empire's diplomats met with the human representatives aboard a neutral station, a massive space station located at the edge of Empire territory. It was a symbol of peace and cooperation, a place where species from all corners of the galaxy could come together to talk, trade, and learn from one another. The humans had prepared for this meeting for months, carefully crafting their message and presenting their goals with a sense of calm and professionalism. They were eager to show the Empire that they could be trusted, that they were not a threat to the established order. The humans were not naive. They knew that their success as a species would depend on their ability to navigate the complexities of galactic politics. They had studied the history of the Empire, and the many other species that had risen and fallen within its vast borders. They knew that gaining the trust of the Empire would be the first step toward gaining access to the resources, knowledge, and alliances that would allow them to flourish. But they also understood the risks. The Empire was not a simple political entity. It was a military powerhouse, a force to be reckoned with. And yet, despite its formidable reputation, the humans had come prepared. They believed that diplomacy and cooperation were the keys to their success. At first, the meeting was cordial. The human representatives spoke with confidence, explaining their intentions and their desire for peace and mutual benefit. They emphasized their commitment to exploring the stars, to learning from other species, and to contributing to the greater good of the galaxy. The Empire's diplomats, seasoned and wise, listened carefully. They were impressed by the humans' determination and ambition, but they were also wary. The Empire had dealt with many species over the centuries, and they had seen how quickly things could turn sour. Empires could crumble just as quickly as they were built, and the galaxy was a dangerous place for those who did not understand its harsh realities. As the meeting progressed, the diplomats from both sides began to discuss more practical matters: trade agreements, technology sharing, and the potential for alliances. The humans were eager to establish these connections, to show that they could offer something of value to the Empire. They presented their advances in space travel and energy production, hoping to impress their hosts with the sheer scope of their technological progress. The Empire's diplomats, however, were less impressed than the humans had hoped. They understood that the humans were still in the early stages of their exploration, and while their technology was advanced, it was not yet on par with that of the Empire. But the humans were not deterred. They pressed on, focusing on the one thing they knew would capture the Empire's attention: their military potential. The humans had long believed in the power of their military, not just in terms of force, but in their ability to adapt, to innovate, and to outthink their enemies. They had a long history of overcoming challenges through sheer will and ingenuity. It was this spirit that had allowed them to survive on Earth, and it was this spirit they hoped to bring to the galaxy. As the negotiations continued, the Empire's diplomats grew more cautious. They had begun to see a pattern in the human approach, an underlying drive for dominance, a desire not just to coexist, but to expand, to conquer. The humans were not content to merely be a part of the galaxy. They wanted to lead it, to shape it according to their vision. It was not an overt threat, but it was a subtle one that the Empire's diplomats could not ignore. The warning bells, faint at first, began to ring in their minds. Still, the Empire was determined to give the humans a chance. They had seen this kind of ambition before: species that sought power, but who were willing to play by the rules of galactic society. The Empire had been built on alliances, on the understanding that strength could be used to maintain peace, but also that there were limits to what any one species could achieve. The humans, for all their potential, had yet to prove themselves in the larger scheme of things. But there was another factor at play, one that neither the humans nor the Empire could have predicted. The galaxy was vast, and its many species were not always unified in their views of the humans. While the Empire's diplomats were cautiously optimistic about humanity's future, others in the galaxy were more skeptical. There were those who saw humanity's rapid expansion as a sign of danger, a sign that they were on the path to becoming a new threat to galactic stability. This lore, of course, had been warning the galaxy for years, but their warnings had been dismissed as the ramblings of a paranoid race. Now, however, as humanity's presence in the galaxy grew stronger, other species began to take notice. The humans were making waves, whether they realized it or not. In the shadows of the galaxy, factions were beginning to form. Some species, already wary of humanity's rising influence, began to form alliances of their own, seeking to counterbalance the humans' power. They did not trust the humans, and they saw their arrival as the beginning of a new chapter in galactic conflict. But for now, These factions were still in the early stages, still trying to determine how best to deal with the humans. It would not be long before the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface would boil over, and the galaxy would find itself at a crossroads. For the humans, however, the meeting with the Empire was just the beginning. They had made their first step onto the galactic stage, and they were determined to make the most of it. They had a plan, a vision for the future, and they believed in their ability to achieve it. But they were also learning something crucial. The galaxy was not a place where ambition alone could carry them. They would need to adapt, to learn from their mistakes, and to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that stretched across the stars. The humans had taken their first steps into the galaxy, and the future was still unwritten. But one thing was clear: the galaxy would never be the same again, not as time passed. The initial excitement surrounding humanity's arrival in the wider galaxy began to fade, and a more uncomfortable truth started to surface. The Galactic Empire, once hopeful about the potential of humanity, began to see cracks in the facade of diplomacy that had been carefully crafted. The humans, with their energy and ambition, were not content simply to be peaceful explorers in the stars. They wanted to expand, to grow, and to impose their own way of life on the galaxy. At first, these signs were subtle, but they were their human leaders talking more about conquest than coexistence. A growing military presence on the border planets, and a general sense that humanity was not entirely interested in following the same rules as the rest of the galaxy. What had initially been a hopeful exploration of shared knowledge was quickly turning into a contest of power. The humans had made their first steps onto the galactic stage, and while they had been welcomed by some, others were beginning to see them as a potential threat. They were not a species to be taken lightly. Their relentless determination and impressive technological advancements were quickly becoming their hallmark. And that was precisely what worried the more cautious races of the galaxy. They could see the writing on the wall. One of the first signs that the humans were different from other species was their rapid militarization. It wasn't that they were necessarily building massive war fleets, at least. Not at first, but they were quick to establish military outposts, to build defenses around their colonies, and to create alliances with other species that shared their interests. While most of the galaxy's more peaceful races preferred diplomacy, trade, and subtle influence, the humans were more direct. They took matters into their own hands, pushing back when they felt threatened and asserting control over what they believed was rightfully theirs. The Galactic Empire, which had been more than willing to accept the humans as part of the greater galactic community, began to rethink its position. They had allowed the humans to expand into their sector, assuming that they would play by the rules. But the more the Empire observed, the more they realized that the humans weren't interested in the same rules that governed the galaxy. They weren't just interested in peace. They were interested in power. The question wasn't whether humanity was dangerous, it was how dangerous they were willing to become. The Empire's diplomats, who had once seen the humans as a promising new ally, began to voice their concerns more openly. They started to press the human representatives, asking tougher questions about their intentions, their plans, and their true goals. Was humanity's growing influence in the galaxy a peaceful expansion, or was it something more? The human leaders, while still claiming a commitment to peace, couldn't hide the truth anymore. They wanted to grow, to take more control of the stars, and to become a dominant force. This shift in the human attitude was not lost on the other species of the galaxy. Some, particularly those who had been cautious about humanity from the start, began to take action. They saw what the humans were doing and grew worried. They saw the rising military presence, the fortifications around key planets, and the general tone of aggression that had started to creep into human diplomacy. This lore, the ancient race that had warned the galaxy of humanity's potential for destruction, began to feel vindicated. They had known this was coming. They had tried to warn everyone, but no one had listened. Now, they could only watch as humanity began to show its true colors. Other species, less warlike than the Empire, saw these same signs and began to form their own opinions. There were whispers in the galactic corridors, quiet conversations held in secret, and cautious alliances forming. No one trusted humanity, but few were willing to say it out loud. It wasn't just the humans' drive for power, it was the fact that they didn't seem to care about the established order of the galaxy. They were pushing the boundaries, testing the limits, and many wondered how far they would go before the galaxy had to act. The Galactic Empire, seeing these growing tensions, called for a special session of the Galactic Council. It wasn't just a matter of diplomacy anymore. It was a matter of survival. The Council, once a body of cooperation and mutual respect, was beginning to crack. The humans had upset the delicate balance, and now there were factions within the Council, some advocating for stronger action against humanity, and others arguing for continued engagement. But the warnings were coming from all sides. The humans were not as benign as they had seemed, and their unchecked ambition was starting to pose a real threat. The Empire itself was deeply divided. Some of its leaders, particularly those who had supported the initial contact with the humans, still believed that there was hope for peace, that humanity could be brought into the fold of galactic society. But others had seen enough. They argued that humanity's expansion was becoming too dangerous to ignore. The military leaders, who had been watching the rise of human power with growing concern, were now openly discussing the possibility of preemptive action. They believed that if the galaxy didn't act soon, it would be too late. The humans would be too strong, too entrenched, and would refuse to back down. The diplomatic meetings with the humans had become more tense, more guarded. The humans, for their part, didn't seem to understand why their actions were being met with suspicion. To them, they were just doing what any species would do. They were securing their future, ensuring their place in the galaxy. They saw the reactions from the Empire and other species as a challenge to their right to grow and expand. They believed they had earned their place at the table, and they weren't going to let anyone push them aside. Meanwhile, the rest of the galaxy watched, holding their breath. The rising tension was palpable. The Slore, from their distant corner of the galaxy, watched with knowing eyes. They had warned the galaxy, but there was little they could do now. All they could do was hope that the galaxy would wake up before it was too late. The next few months were crucial. The Empire's military began to mobilize, and their diplomats continued to push the humans for answers. The humans, meanwhile, held firm in their stance. They had no intention of backing down. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about their destiny. They believed that they were destined to lead the galaxy, to bring order and stability in their own way. And if the galaxy couldn't accept that, they would make it accept them. The warning signs were everywhere now. The humans were no longer just a hopeful species seeking peaceful coexistence. They had become a force to be reckoned with, a species that would not be easily contained. The galaxy, divided and uncertain, stood on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to confront the rising power of humanity or try to find a way to coexist with it. But one thing was clear: the galaxy would never be the same again. And as the human ships moved ever forward, the question that hung in the air was not if they would change the galaxy, but how. Would they be the force that brought peace and progress, or the one that tore everything apart? It wasn't long before the uneasy peace between humanity and the Galactic Empire began to unravel. The situation had been building for months, with tensions rising between the humans and the established powers of the galaxy. What had once seemed like a chance for peaceful cooperation was now quickly turning into a powder keg, with each new development adding fuel to the fire. And then it happened. A single event that would ignite the spark of war. It all started with a peaceful alien race called the Virox, a species known for their advanced technology and deep commitment to pacifism. The Virox had long been respected in the galaxy for their wisdom and diplomatic skills. They had built a society that was centered around peace and understanding, and they had lived in harmony with their neighbors for centuries. Yet, despite their peaceful ways, the Virox had one thing that the humans desperately wanted: access to the mysterious technology that could accelerate their space exploration. The humans had been trying to make contact with the Virox for years, but the Virox had always been hesitant. They were cautious about letting new species into their fold, especially species as young and ambitious as humanity. The humans, however, were persistent. They sent more ships, offered more trade agreements, and showed more interest in learning from the Virox than any other species in the galaxy. Eventually, their efforts paid off. The Virox agreed to a meeting. At first, the talk seemed promising. The humans, eager to gain access to the Virox's technology, offered everything they could: resources, trade agreements, and alliances. The Virox, in turn, welcomed the humans with open arms. They believed that humanity, despite its flaws, could be a force for good in the galaxy. Perhaps, they thought, humanity's drive for exploration and expansion could one day align with their own values of peace and cooperation. But there was a catch. The Virox made it clear that they would not share their most advanced technology with humanity unless they could prove that they were capable of using it responsibly. They would not allow such powerful tools to fall into the hands of a species still learning to coexist with other galactic powers. The humans, eager to expand and increase their influence, saw this as a roadblock. They were not used to being told no, especially by a species they had been working so hard to engage with. At first, the humans tried to negotiate, offering more incentives and promising to respect the Virox's wishes. They even agreed to non-aggression pacts, ensuring the Virox that they had no intention of using their technology for destructive purposes. But the Virox, cautious as ever, remained firm in their decision. They had seen enough of the galaxies, wars and power struggles, to know that even the most well-intentioned species could turn dangerous when given the power to destroy. Frustration began to grow among the human leaders. They had put in so much effort to get to this point, and yet the Virox were turning them away. They couldn't understand why the Virox refused to see the potential in humanity, why they couldn't trust them with their most valuable knowledge. For the first time, humanity's patience began to wear thin, and that's when things went terribly wrong. One day, during a routine diplomatic visit to a Virox colony, a human ship was attacked. No one knew exactly who had fired the first shot, but the results were disastrous. The humans, now enraged and convinced that the Virox had attacked them, retaliated with a full-scale assault. What had started as a diplomatic meeting turned into a violent confrontation in the blink of an eye. The Virox, unable to defend themselves against the humans' superior technology and military tactics, were quickly overwhelmed. Their peaceful society was shattered in a single brutal strike. Entire cities were wiped off the map, their advanced technology falling into the hands of the humans. It was a massacre, and the galaxy watched in horror as the humans, once seen as a hopeful species, now stood as the aggressors. The Galactic Empire, which had been observing humanity's rise with growing concern, could no longer ignore what had happened. The attack on the Virox homeworld was not just an isolated incident. It was a clear sign that humanity had crossed a line. The Empire's leaders, who had once hoped that diplomacy would work, now realized that humanity could not be trusted to follow the same rules as the rest of the galaxy. They had shown that they were willing to use force to get what they wanted, and that was a danger to everyone. The Empire's response was swift. They called for an emergency meeting of the Galactic Council, urging immediate action against the humans. But the council was divided. There were those who believed that the humans could still be reasoned with, that the attack on the Virox was an isolated incident driven by misunderstanding and frustration. But there were others, those who had been watching humanity's rise with skepticism, who saw this as the beginning of something far more dangerous. They believed that humanity's unchecked ambition was not only a threat to the galaxy's peace, but to its very survival. Behind closed doors, the Empire's military leaders began to discuss the unthinkable war with humanity. The humans, despite their rapid technological progress and growing military power, were still a relatively small force compared to the mighty Empire. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the fact that the humans had shown their willingness to destroy everything in their path to get what they wanted. It was a danger that the galaxy could not afford to ignore. As the discussions within the Empire and the Galactic Council grew more heated, humanity continued its expansion. The humans, seeing the chaos caused by their actions, felt a sense of empowerment. They had just defeated one of the most peaceful and advanced species in the galaxy, and they were not about to stop. The victory over the Virox only fueled their belief that they could conquer anything. They were no longer just seeking alliances, they were taking what they wanted. By force if necessary. The Empire's fleet was put on high alert, and tensions between the two sides escalated with every passing day. Diplomacy had failed. Negotiations had failed. Now, it seemed, only war remained. The once dominant Galactic Empire, which had ruled over the stars for centuries, found itself at a crossroads. If they didn't act soon, humanity would be too strong to stop. The galaxy had changed. The human species, which had once been seen as a hopeful newcomer to the stars, had now become a force to be reckoned with. Their aggression, their ambition, and their willingness to destroy anything in their way had set the stage for a new kind of conflict. The Empire, once the uncontested power in the galaxy, was now fighting for its survival. And humanity, with its fierce determination and relentless drive, was ready to take its place at the top of the galactic order. The war was inevitable. The galaxy had been warned, but now it was too late. The stage was set, and the first shots had been fired. The future of the galaxy would be determined by the outcome of this conflict. Would the humans become the new rulers of the stars, or would the galaxy rise up and stop them before it was too late? The galaxy had entered a new era, one that was darker and more uncertain than anyone could have predicted. The attack on the Virox homeworld had marked the tipping point. Humanity, which had once been seen as a hopeful species, now stood at the center of a growing conflict that threatened to engulf the entire galaxy. The Galactic Empire, which had been trying to avoid war for as long as possible, was left with no choice but to act. The time for diplomacy had passed. The only option left was force. The Empire's decision to go to war against humanity was not taken lightly. Their fleet, one of the most powerful in the galaxy, began to mobilize. But the humans were not an easy target. They had proven time and again that they could adapt to any challenge. Their military, while smaller than the Empire's, was more than capable of fighting back. They had learned quickly, not only from their own history, but also from the mistakes of other species. Their tactics were unconventional, and they relied on speed, surprise, and resourcefulness. The humans had come to understand that in war, it wasn't always about the size of the army, it was about how you used it. The first few engagements between the two forces were intense. The humans, despite being outnumbered, fought with a ferocity that the Empire had never encountered. The human ships, smaller but faster than the Empire's, darted through space like predators, striking swiftly and then retreating before the Empire could fully react. They used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, making hit-and-run tactics a hallmark of their strategy. The Empire, with its massive fleets and advanced weaponry, was caught off guard by how quickly the humans could move and how much damage they could inflict in such a short time. Despite their initial success, the humans were far from invincible. The Empire, with its vast resources and decades of military experience, began to regroup and adjust its strategies. They deployed new fleets, called in reinforcements from distant sectors, and began to cut off human supply lines. The conflict quickly escalated, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The galaxy, which had once been a place of relative peace and cooperation, was now a war zone. Planets that had once been neutral found themselves drawn into the conflict, either forced to take sides or simply caught in the crossfire dot as the war dragged on. It became clear that the humans were not going to back down. The Empire's military might was immense, but humanity's resolve was stronger than anyone had anticipated. They fought for survival, for the chance to shape their own future. Their military leaders, while inexperienced in galactic-scale warfare, proved to be brilliant tacticians. They used everything at their disposal: advanced technology, guerrilla warfare, and their sheer determination to outmaneuver the Empire at every turn. The humans were not just fighting for power. They were fighting for their right to exist. But it wasn't just the human military that kept the Empire at bay. The civilians, too, played a crucial role in the war effort. Back on Earth, and in the human colonies scattered across the galaxy, people from all walks of life rallied behind the cause. Scientists worked around the clock to develop new weapons. Engineers rebuilt damaged ships, and ordinary men and women volunteered to fight. The human spirit, it seemed, was unbreakable. For all the destruction the war had caused, it had also united humanity in ways no one could have imagined. They were no longer just individuals or isolated nations. They were one people, one species, united by a common cause. The human fleet, though still smaller than the Empire's, began to gain ground. They captured key territories and held on to their victories with unwavering determination. They didn't have the luxury of overwhelming firepower or infinite resources like the Empire, but they made up for it with ingenuity and resilience. They created new alliances with other species who were disillusioned with the Empire's tactics. These species, many of whom had been quietly observing the rise of humanity, now saw in the humans a new hope. A hope for a galaxy that could be more than just an endless cycle of power struggles. The Galactic Empire, meanwhile, began to feel the pressure. The losses were mounting, and the morale of their troops was beginning to falter. The Empire's vast bureaucratic structure, once a symbol of order and control, was now bogged down by inefficiency and infighting. The leaders who had once been so confident in their ability to maintain order were now divided. Some called for a renewed push to crush humanity once and for all. Others, more cautious, warned that the cost of continued war was too high. The Empire's vast resources were dwindling, and the human resistance was far stronger than anyone had anticipated. The once unimaginable thought began to take root. Could humanity actually win this war? The turning point came when the humans launched a bold offensive against one of the Empire's key military hubs. It was a risky move, one that could have ended in disaster, but the humans had nothing left to lose. They had been pushed to the edge, and they knew this was their chance. The attack, swift and brutal, crippled the Empire's fleet in the sector. It was a blow that the Empire could not easily recover from. The humans had shown that they were capable of striking at the heart of the Empire, and they had done so with devastating effectiveness. In the wake of the attack, the Empire was forced to reconsider its strategy. The human resistance, which had once been seen as a nuisance, was now a legitimate threat. The Empire's leadership knew that they could not afford to underestimate humanity any longer. The war had taken a dark turn, and there was no turning back. For the humans, the victory was bittersweet. They had proven their strength and resilience, but the cost had been immense. Entire fleets had been destroyed, and countless lives had been lost. The galaxy was scarred by the conflict, and the future was uncertain. The humans had shown that they were more than capable of holding their ground. But they had also shown that war, even when fought for survival, was a brutal and unforgiving force. As the war continued, both sides dug in for what promised to be a long and bloody conflict. The humans, with their newly gained victories, now faced the hard truth. They were fighting not just for survival, but for their place in the galaxy. The Empire, shaken but still powerful, was determined to put an end to the human uprising. It was a battle for the future of the galaxy, and there was no telling how it would end. But one thing was certain: the war had only just begun. And as both sides prepared for the next phase of the conflict, the galaxy held its breath, waiting to see who would emerge victorious. Would the humans continue to defy the odds, or would the might of the Empire crush them once and for all? The war between humanity and the Galactic Empire had reached a point where neither side could claim clear victory, but both sides were growing weary. What began as a conflict driven by ambition and survival had evolved into something more complex: struggle for the future of the galaxy itself. The cost of war was now clear. Planets lay in ruin, billions of lives had been lost, and entire sectors of space were scarred by the violence. Yet, in the midst of this destruction, something unexpected was happening. Humanity was changing. As the war dragged on, the initial impulse of survival gave way to something deeper. The people of Earth and the human colonies spread across the galaxy were beginning to ask themselves difficult questions. What were they truly fighting for? Was it power, territory, or something else entirely? They had once believed that the stars were there for the taking, that their destiny was to rise above the rest. But now, as the war waged on, many began to realize that their actions might lead to something worse than they ever imagined. They had fought for survival, but at what cost? Was the galaxy doomed to endless conflict, or was there a way forward, one that didn't involve destruction? On both sides of the conflict, people began to question the war. Within the human ranks, voices emerged calling for an end to the violence, for peace talks, for diplomacy. Some had come to realize that the pursuit of dominance had clouded their judgment. They had wanted to prove their strength, to show that humanity could stand as equals among the stars. But now they were faced with a galaxy that had been torn apart by their ambition. Even in the Empire, cracks were beginning to show. The leadership, once united in their resolve to crush humanity, was now divided. Some saw the humans' determination and their ability to fight against the most powerful empire in the galaxy as a sign of their strength. Perhaps there was more to humanity than anyone had realized. Others, however, saw their actions as a threat to the order and peace that the empire had worked so hard to build. There were whispers of rebellion within the empire's own ranks, as soldiers and officers began to question the morality of the war. Could they really justify fighting to destroy an entire species, especially one that had once seemed so promising? The idea of peace was becoming a more appealing thought to many, but the path to peace seemed impossible. The wounds of war ran deep, and there was no easy way to heal them. How could humanity and the Empire ever trust one another again? How could they ever undo the damage that had been done? The answers to these questions seemed elusive, but that didn't stop people from hoping for a different future. In the midst of this growing unrest, a quiet movement began to form. It started as a whisper, a secret alliance of individuals from both sides of the conflict, working behind the scenes to bring an end to the war. The members of this group came from different walks of life: soldiers, diplomats, scientists, and civilians, but they all shared one common belief: the war had to end. Before it destroyed everything, this movement was not without its risks. Those who spoke out against the war, whether human or imperial, were often silenced, either by force or by political pressure. The Empire, still struggling to maintain its authority, could not afford to show weakness. The humans, likewise, were still deeply divided. The war had become a symbol of their pride, and admitting that it was wrong would be seen as a failure. But the movement gained momentum as more and more people realized that they were fighting not for freedom or justice, but for power that came at a terrible cost. The leaders of the movement, both human and imperial, knew that they needed a way to communicate their message to the wider galaxy, to show everyone that peace was still possible. They needed to find a way to bypass the propaganda machines of both the Empire and the human war factions, which had been pushing their own narratives for so long. This would be no small task, but they believed it was worth the risk. If they could convince enough people on both sides that the war was senseless, they might be able to stop it before it was too late. While this covert peace movement grew, the war continued. Skirmishes between human and imperial forces broke out regularly. Planets were still being bombed, and fleets still clashed in the void of space. But with each passing day, there was a growing sense that something had shifted. The people who were fighting, the soldiers on both sides, were starting to ask themselves why. Why were they still fighting? Why had so much death and destruction become the new normal? In one particular battle, one of the largest confrontations since the war began, something remarkable happened. As the two fleets collided in the heart of a neutral system, a strange moment of clarity passed through both sides. In the chaos of battle, as ships fired on each other and soldiers fought on the ground, there was a sudden break in the fighting. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't a coordinated effort, but in the middle of the war, for just a moment, the soldiers on both sides stopped. The fighting halted, if only briefly, as a sense of shared humanity washed over them. They saw each other not as enemies, but as people, caught in a conflict they didn't fully understand. That brief moment was all it took. It wasn't enough to end the war, but it was enough to spark something powerful. Word spread through both human and imperial ranks about the ceasefire, about the brief time when everyone stopped and remembered why they had started fighting in the first place. It gave birth to a new understanding. They were all people. They were all struggling to survive. And though they may have been on opposite sides, they shared a common desire to live in a galaxy where peace was possible. With this spark of hope, the peace movement accelerated. Leaders from both the human resistance and the Empire came together in secret meetings. They knew that peace was the only way forward, but they also knew the risks. There were those on both sides who were determined to keep the war going, who saw it as their chance for dominance, who believed that humanity and the Empire could never coexist peacefully. The peace movement would need to be careful, or it would be crushed before it had a chance to grow. But the movement had one thing on its side: the people. The soldiers, the civilians, the leaders, and the fighters, they were all tired of the war. And they were ready for something else. They were ready for a new kind of galaxy, one where their children wouldn't have to grow up in the shadow of war. They didn't want to be remembered as the generation that destroyed everything. They wanted to be remembered as the generation that chose peace, even when it seemed impossible. As the movement gained ground, the leaders of both sides knew that they had reached a critical point. If they didn't act soon, the war would continue, and the damage would be irreversible. But if they could push through their differences and come to the table, they could save not just themselves, but the future of the galaxy. The journey was far from over, and peace was still a long way off. But the hope that had been born in the midst of battle was growing stronger with each passing day. Humanity and the Empire had been locked in a struggle for survival and power, but now they faced a choice: continue to destroy everything in their path, or choose to build something better. It would take time, trust, and sacrifice, but the seeds of a new future had been planted, and though the war was not yet over, for the first time there was a glimmer of hope that peace might someday be possible.